This story begins on the cold steps of a bustling city bank, where a man most overlooked sat unnoticed. People thought he was just another beggar with no future, no power, and no voice. But behind his worn clothes and weary eyes was a story far greater than anyone could imagine, a story that would flip the balance of power inside those very doors. Before the city realized who he was, the man on the steps would show the world that appearances deceive and that silence can hide extraordinary strength. The morning rush in downtown was always a storm of footsteps, voices, and polished shoes tapping against marble. Suits brushed past one another as people hustled through revolving glass doors, briefcases in hand, eyes glued to glowing phone screens. Against this backdrop of wealth and speed sat a man who seemed entirely out of place. Slouched on the gray stone steps, with a battered backpack pressed tightly to his chest, he looked like a fixture people had grown used to ignoring. His clothes were worn and stained, his coat too thin for the sharp bite of the morning wind. His face was hidden under a messy beard, and his hair, uncombed for weeks, fell across his forehead in tangled strands. Most people barely looked at him. A few darted glances, and quickly turned away as if afraid that eye contact might somehow make them responsible for his existence. Others whispered as they passed, exchanging judgments cloaked in superiority. Some even sneered openly, muttering insults that carried just enough volume for him to hear. "Another one who won't get up and work," one man said under his breath to his colleague. A young woman with designer heels clicked past him, wrinkling her nose as if his mere presence offended her. And yet, for all the ridicule and disregard, the man did not flinch. He sat with an odd calmness, as though their words never reached him. His sharp eyes, however, told another story. They followed everything. Each hurried step, each dismissive glance, each insult hurled his way. His gaze was steady and calculating, not the dull, vacant stare many expected from someone in his condition. It was as if he were quietly studying the world that had turned its back on him. The steps had become his daily spot, a place where he could fade into the crowd's blind spot while still watching life unfold. To most, he was invisible. To him, they were an endless parade of characters revealing their true selves in the small ways they treated a man they thought had nothing. He had grown used to the rhythm of their behavior. The morning rush of bankers and executives, the midday lull with tourists and shoppers, the evening wave of tired employees heading home. Every insult was familiar, every look of pity or disgust predictable. But what nobody knew, not even those who passed him every day, was that this man was not what he appeared to be. His ragged clothing and tired face were masks concealing a depth few could comprehend. The backpack he clutched wasn't just filled with scraps and belongings. It carried a fragment of a life far different from the one the crowd assumed he lived. On this particular morning, the air seemed sharper, the wind colder, and the city more indifferent than ever. A drizzle from the night before still glistened on the pavement, reflecting the towering glass facade of the bank. Employees bustled through the entrance, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Inside, warmth and wealth thrived. Outside, on the steps, one man carried the weight of survival on his shoulders. A little boy tugged at his mother's hand as they passed, pointing curiously at the man. "Why is he sitting there, Mama?" The mother quickly hushed him, pulling him away with a firm hand. She didn't answer. She didn't dare. To acknowledge the man would mean admitting that such a fall from grace could happen to anyone. To her, it was easy to treat him as if he didn't exist. The man lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but to avoid the familiar sting of rejection. He had once been accustomed to conversations, respect, and recognition. Now, silence was his constant companion. But behind that silence was a reservoir of memories, skills, and dignity that the world could not erase. His silence was not weakness, it was patience. The city often spoke of success as if it were permanent, but he knew otherwise. He had learned the hard way how fragile it could be. A single deal gone wrong, a betrayal from someone trusted, or a twist of fate could dismantle everything. And when it did, society had no mercy. People loved the image of success, but once stripped of it, a man became invisible. As the morning stretched on, he watched dozens pass by, each absorbed in their own world. Some threw coins his way without even meeting his eyes, as though tossing crumbs to a stray dog. Others made sharp comments meant to wound. Yet through it all, he remained still, steady, like stone weathered by time. There was no anger in his posture, only a quiet endurance that puzzled those who cared to notice. But if anyone had dared to stop and really look into his eyes, they would have seen something strange. It wasn't the hollow despair most expected from a man on the streets. It was focus. It was depth. It was a kind of knowing that unsettled those rare few who made eye contact before quickly breaking away. The man was not broken. He was waiting. By midday, the streets grew louder, filled with honking horns and chatter spilling from nearby cafes. The scent of roasted coffee and fresh bread drifted through the air. Across the steps, polished shoes and high heels clicked against stone, contrasting sharply with a man's scuffed boots. The contrast between his existence and theirs was painfully clear, and yet he never let the difference break his quiet composure. For him, the steps were not just a place of rest. They were a vantage point. From here, he could see who people truly were. When stripped of performance, stripped of stage kindness, how did they treat someone they thought was beneath them? He had come to learn that the true measure of character wasn't revealed in boardrooms or parties, but in moments like these, when one decided whether to kick a man who had already fallen. And so he sat, patient, observant, silent. Every insult became a note in his memory. Every laugh another thread in the fabric of his quiet determination. No one knew what lay behind his silence. No one suspected the story buried beneath the surface. To them, he was just another man on the steps. But soon, the city would learn otherwise. The late morning sunlight glared off the towering glass facade of the bank, scattering reflections across the busy street. The man on the steps shifted slightly, his arm still wrapped protectively around his worn backpack, his eyes locked on the constant flow of people who treated him as if he were a ghost. Yet, in the rhythm of the day, there was always one moment that stood out, a moment when the atmosphere on the street shifted, as though even the air itself acknowledged a change in presence. It was the arrival of the man who ruled this building. The CEO. The crowd outside the bank thinned for just a second, footsteps slowing, conversations hushed, and heads turning toward the glossy black car that pulled up against the curb. The door opened with a mechanical smoothness, and from within emerged a man who seemed to carry the weight of wealth and arrogance in equal measure. Tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in a tailored navy suit, he stepped onto the pavement like he owned not just a building, but the entire block. His polished leather shoes gleamed under the sun, his silk tie a perfect knot of power. Behind him trailed two assistants, each carrying documents and phones, ready to follow orders before they were even spoken. The CEO didn't need to announce who he was. Everyone already knew. His reputation stretched far beyond this street. He was the kind of man who built empires from numbers on paper, who crushed competitors with a handshake masked as a deal, who turned opportunity into dominance. But with that power came cruelty, a sharpness that cut through anyone he deemed beneath him. To the employees inside, he was both fear and ambition embodied. To the world outside, he was a face of wealth that looked down on all who hadn't climbed as high. And now, his gaze fell on the man sitting quietly on the steps. For a brief moment, the CEO slowed, tilting his head, squinting slightly as though to ensure that the figure slumped before him was indeed what he thought he saw. A homeless man, a beggar, a blemish on the pristine front of his bank. His lips curled into a smirk, and a sharp laugh slipped past his teeth. "Well," he said loudly, ensuring his assistants and anyone within earshot could hear, "what do we have here? Another one who couldn't manage to get off the streets." The words cut through the bustling noise of the street, reaching the ears of passing pedestrians who glanced curiously before continuing on their way. The assistants chuckled awkwardly, unsure if the laughter was expected of them or if it would be safer to stay silent. The CEO, however, had no doubts. He thrived on being heard, on making his opinions unavoidable. The man on the steps did not respond. He didn't lift his head, didn't flinch, didn't even shift his position. His silence, instead of satisfying the CEO, seemed to provoke him further. The powerful man took a slow step closer, his polished shoe landing heavily on the first stone step, as if to establish his dominance in the most literal sense. "You sit here every day, don't you?" he continued, voice dripping with mockery. "Pathetic. Perfect spot, though outside my bank. Do you like watching real men go in and out? Men who actually work? Or do you just hope someone will take pity and toss you a coin?" The assistants laughed again, more confidently this time, as though their leader's cruelty gave them permission. A couple of passers-by stopped briefly, their eyes darting between the CEO and the homeless man, sensing a spectacle unfolding. The marble walls of the bank entrance amplified the sound, making the ridicule echo louder than it should have. Still, the man on the steps remained silent. His eyes flickered upward briefly, meeting the CEO's gaze just for an instant. The look wasn't one of fear, nor anger, nor even shame. It was steady, calm, and unsettlingly unshaken. Then his gaze dropped again, as though he had dismissed the confrontation entirely. The CEO's smirk faltered for a second, but his ego quickly rallied. He turned slightly, addressing not the man but his assistants and the small crowd gathering. "You see this?" he declared, gesturing toward the homeless figure. "This is what happens when you waste your life. Laziness, weakness, a refusal to adapt. He could have chosen differently, but he didn't, and now look where he is." The words were meant as a lesson, a performance of superiority for all who heard them. The assistants nodded obediently, murmuring their agreement. Some of the crowd smirked, emboldened by the CEO's stance, finding it easy to mock someone when their leader had already stripped away the man's dignity. Others shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke against him. Silence became complicity, and cruelty echoed louder than compassion. The homeless man still said nothing. His silence, in its own way, was louder than words. It left a strange unease hanging in the air, as if he knew something the CEO did not. But the powerful man, blind in his arrogance, mistook that silence for submission. The CEO adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his tie, and chuckled. "I'll tell you something, gentlemen," he said to his assistants, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "People like him are the reason men like me exist. Without the failures, how would the winners shine? Without the weak, how would the strong prove their worth? He is nothing but a reminder of what happens when you stop trying." The assistants laughed obediently again, one even pulling out his phone to check the time, eager for cruelty to end so they could move inside. But the CEO wasn't finished. He leaned down slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only the man on the steps could hear. "Men like you don't belong near men like me," he hissed, his tone stripped of a performative flair. "You're a blemish, an embarrassment. If it were up to me, you wouldn't even be allowed to sit here." For a heartbeat, silence lingered between them. The homeless man's eyes lifted once more, locking with the CEO's. The look was piercing, unwavering, and disturbingly calm. It wasn't defiance, not quite, but something deeper, a quiet knowing, a patience that unsettled the CEO far more than anger ever could. He straightened quickly, brushing off the moment with forced arrogance. "Come on," he barked at his assistants, his voice loud again. "We're wasting time." He strode up the remaining steps, the glass doors opening automatically as if recognizing their master. His entourage followed, leaving the man on the steps alone once more. But the laughter lingered, echoing against the marble, etching itself into the memory of all who heard it. Inside the bank, employees had already caught whispers of the scene outside. Some chuckled under their breath, repeating the CEO's words. Others glanced nervously toward the entrance, unsure whether to admire his boldness or question the necessity of his cruelty. The lobby buzzed with the energy of gossip, and yet, at the center of it all, the man on the steps remained exactly where he had been, untouched, unbroken, and unreadable. The CEO walked to the marble lobby, head held high, the sound of his shoes crisp against the floor. He had humiliated a man and, in doing so, reminded his audience of his dominance. To him, it was just another morning, another performance of power. To the man on the steps, however, it was the beginning of something far greater. For though he sat in silence, the words spoken against him were not forgotten. They settled in his memory like weights, not dragging him down, but building the foundation of something waiting to rise. The laughter that echoed through the lobby was not the sound of victory. It was a sound of arrogance that would soon collapse under its own weight. And so, as the glass doors closed behind the CEO, sealing him inside his world of marble and wealth, the man on the steps adjusted his backpack slightly and leaned back against the cold stone. He remained silent, but his eyes, sharp as ever, followed the movements inside. The power imbalance was clear for now. One man ruled the bank, and the other was dismissed as nothing. But power, like fortune, was never permanent. The CEO didn't know it yet, but the man he mocked was not what he seemed. The marble lobby of the bank shimmered under golden lights, its vast ceiling arching high above polished floors. Chandeliers hung like crowns, their crystals scattered reflections across sleek counters and glass partitions. It was a place built to impress, wealth carved into stone and steel, designed to make visitors feel both small and in awe of the empire it represented. Yet beneath the glow of refinement, an uglier truth began to stir, one that was not reflected in the architecture, but in the hearts of the people inside. The CEO's words still echoed faintly, carried in whispers from one cluster of employees to another. Those who hadn't witnessed the scene directly had already heard about it from those who had. The retelling was swift, each version slightly exaggerated. The CEO's cutting remarks, the assistant's laughter, the way the homeless man had simply sat there, mute, as if crushed by the weight of his own failure. By the time the gossip reached the far end of the lobby, it was no longer just a moment. It was a spectacle, a story to pass along as entertainment while transactions and signatures waited. The homeless man remained on the steps outside, but his presence was like a shadow inside the building. From their desks, tellers glanced occasionally toward the glass doors, their curiosity mingled with disdain. Customers in fine suits and tailored dresses leaned toward one another, their conversations shifting from business to mockery. "Can you believe he just sits there every day?" One man muttered as he stood in line, his voice pitched just high enough for others to hear. "Disgusting. Probably spends every penny on booze." A woman behind him chuckled softly. "They always claim they're down on their luck, but they're just lazy. I've worked for everything I have. Why couldn't he?" Their words, casual and careless, slipped easily into the air, joining the chorus of judgments that already lingered. For many, cruelty came without effort. It wasn't always direct, but it was constant, a background hum of superiority that required no thought. The CEO's mockery had given permission. If a man of such power and prestige could laugh at the homeless figure outside, then surely they could too. At a nearby desk, two junior employees whispered between themselves as they pretended to organize paperwork. One leaned forward, smirking. "Did you hear what Mr. Keller said? Perfect spot to watch real men go in and out." He snorted, shaking his head. "Classic. Honestly, he's right. The guy just sits there like a stone." His colleague, a young woman with nervous eyes, hesitated. "I mean, maybe it's not that simple. We don't really know his story." The first employee scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, come on. Don't be naive. You think some genius is sitting outside dressed like that? Please. He's exactly what he looks like. A failure. If Mr. Keller says it, it's true. He sees the world for what it is." The woman pressed her lips together, her doubts silenced not by conviction but by fear. Speaking against the CEO, even indirectly, felt dangerous. Better stay quiet. Even if her conscience tugged at her, this was how the crowd worked. Few ever mocked openly on their own. They drew strength from the leader's cruelty, finding courage in numbers, safety in shared disdain. Alone, many of them might have walked past silently. Together, under the shadow of authority, they became bold, their laughter growing sharper, their voices louder. The homeless man outside shifted slightly, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath. Through the glass doors, he could sense the eyes on him even if he couldn't hear every word. He had grown used to it. The whispers were as constant as the wind, the laughter as predictable as the sunrise. It no longer pierced him the way it once might have. Instead, it layered itself into a quiet resolve, a reminder of the distance between appearance and truth. A group of college students entered the lobby, their chatter filling the space, until one of them caught sight of the figure outside. He nudged his friend, nodding toward the doors. "Look, there he is. Same guy as yesterday." The group turned, amusement sparking in their eyes. "He really doesn't move, does he?" one of them joked. "Like a statue," another laughed. "Bet if you throw him a sandwich, he'd follow you home like a stray dog." Their laughter rang out unrestrained, feeding on itself. A security guard nearby frowned, but said nothing. Confronting paying customers wasn't worth the trouble, especially over a man who was nothing in the eyes of the bank. Silence was easier. Indifference safer. The cruel remarks grew bolder as the day went on. A businessman exiting the bank paused at the steps, glancing down at the homeless man with exaggerated pity. He pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket, held it out just long enough for others to notice, and then dropped it onto the ground instead of into the man's hands. "Pick it up," he said with a smirk, his voice loud enough to draw a small crowd of amused onlookers. "You must be used to it by now." The assistants who had accompanied the CEO earlier happened to pass by at that moment. They chuckled, shaking their heads approvingly. One of them leaned toward the businessman. "Careful," he said with mock seriousness that if you give him too much, he might start thinking he deserves it. The crowd laughed, a ripple of cruel amusement that spread through the onlookers. The homeless man bent slowly, retrieving the bill with steady hands. His expression remained unchanged, neither gratitude nor anger crossing his features. He folded the money carefully and tucked it away, then returned to his silent vigil on the steps. His composure unsettled a few in the crowd. They had expected either gratitude that validated their superiority or anger that confirmed their prejudice. His calmness denied them both, leaving them strangely dissatisfied, but instead of questioning their actions, they doubled down, ridiculing him further in hopes of breaking the mask he wore. Inside, near the teller counters, an older woman whispered to a colleague, "It isn't right the way they treat him." Her colleague gave her a wary glance. "Don't say that too loudly. You know how it is. Mr. Keller doesn't tolerate weakness. If he sees you defending someone like that, it won't end well." The older woman sighed, lowering her voice further. "Still, it's cruel." But she said no more. Her words vanished into the hum of the lobby, swallowed by the louder voices of mockery that filled the air. The psychology of the crowd was a dangerous tide. Alone, people might hesitate, might weigh the morality of their words. Together, they shed those hesitations like old coats, warmed by the shared fire of cruelty. Each laugh emboldened the next, each insult pushed boundaries further. In the safety of numbers, conscience dissolved, replaced by the thrill of being part of something, no matter how ugly. And all the while, the man endured. His silence became a mirror, reflecting their ugliness back at them even as they refused to see it. Every laugh, every sneer, every insult gathered around him like a storm, but he sat unmoved, waiting for a moment that only he seemed to know was coming. By late afternoon, the lobby had become almost theatrical. Customers lingered near the windows just to watch him. Employees exchanged glances and chuckles each time someone new mocked the figure outside. It was no longer about him as a person. He had been stripped of humanity, turned into a prop for entertainment, a symbol of failure that others could measure themselves against. Yet beneath that surface, a tension simmered. Some of those watching felt unease gnawing at them, though they buried it quickly. They couldn't shake the odd feeling that his silence was not submission, but control. That his endurance wasn't weakness, but strength. That perhaps, just perhaps, they were mocking someone who didn't fit the role they had cast him in. But no one spoke these thoughts aloud. Fear and conformity bound their tongues. The crowd had chosen its role, and it played it well. The humiliation grew, the laughter swelled, and the man remained where he was, his patience unbroken, his eyes sharp. For now, the crowd believed it had won. But storms often gather quietly, and the silence before thunder is always mistaken for weakness. The laughter still lingered in the polished marble lobby, bouncing off the cold glass walls as if the building itself joined in the cruelty. The homeless man sat quietly, his back against the steps where humiliation had become almost routine. Yet this moment felt different. The CEO's barbed words carried more weight than the mutterings of strangers. They weren't just insults. They were declarations meant to define him, to cement him as worthless. The crowd's jeers had grown stronger in that shadow of power, but the man on the steps did not flinch. His hand stayed calmly resting on his battered backpack, his eyes unmoving. For a brief second, silence touched him like a secret shield, and then he lifted his head. His lips parted, and instead of rage or pleading, a string of words flowed forth, smooth and lyrical. The sound was so unexpected that the nearest onlookers froze. He was speaking in French, not broken, not halting, but fluent and commanding, each syllable perfectly rounded, carrying the cadence of someone educated in Europe's grand halls of academia. His voice was steady, unhurried, the voice of someone who had no need to raise it to be heard. For the first time, the marble lobby wasn't echoing with laughter. It was echoing with disbelief. At first, many did not understand the language, but they felt its weight. The way he spoke carried dignity, a richness of intellect that could not be masked by his ragged clothes or unshaven face. To those who knew even a word of French, it was immediately clear that this was not a rehearsed trick or a handful of memorized phrases. This was fluency born of years of education and refinement. Even the bank's framed art seemed less sophisticated compared to man's unexpected eloquence. The nearest teller, a young woman who had joined in the laughter, instinctively covered her mouth. The sharpness of her earlier grin dissolved into something like shame. A businessman waiting in line shifted awkwardly, tugging at his tie as if suddenly it strangled him. The power dynamic of the room trembled, no longer perfectly balanced toward the CEO. The mockery that once bound the crowd together was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced with silence so heavy it demanded attention. The CEO himself let out a forced laugh, trying to brush off the moment as though it were nothing more than a party trick. "So, you know a few phrases," he sneered, though the quiver in his voice betrayed the mask he tried to maintain. His assistants looked at him, not with admiration this time, but with the faintest shadow of unease. They, too, had heard enough of the language to recognize mastery when it revealed itself. The homeless man did not rise, nor did he beg for recognition. He simply shifted his gaze across the crowd, his eyes calm, almost patient, as though he had expected this exact moment all along. Then, switching seamlessly back to English, his words were precise and clear, each one ringing with the same authority his French carried. "You mock what you do not understand," he said quietly, his voice cutting sharper than any insult hurled at him. "But ignorance does not erase truth." A wave of discomfort swept through the lobby. The very people who had laughed now avoided his eyes. Some fiddled with their phones, some shifted their weight, but none dared to continue the chorus of ridicule. The shame was theirs now, scattered across the floor like shards of broken glass. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had not been mocking a beggar. They had been mocking a man whose dignity ran deeper than their own fleeting superiority. A small group near the entrance, tourists who understood French, whispered among themselves. Their voices carried words like impeccable, Parisian, scholar. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. His appearance screamed poverty, but his presence whispered prestige. The duality unsettled them, like a portrait hung in the wrong gallery. He wasn't where society expected him to be, and that made him uncomfortable. The CEO sensed a shift too. He straightened his suit jacket, as though tightening the seams could stitch back together the authority he felt slipping from his grasp. The homeless man leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed as if retreating again into his silence, but the echo of his voice lingered. In that echo, questions took root. Who was this man? Where had he learned such language? Why did he hide behind a mask of destitution when his words carried the air of a diplomat? These questions filled the space where laughter once lived, unsettling every person who had joined in the mockery moments before. The CEO, unwilling to concede, tried again. Anyone can learn a second language, he said, louder this time, attempting to reclaim his audience. It doesn't change what you are. His words rang hollow. No applause followed, no chuckles of agreement. Even his most loyal staff hesitated, their eyes darting between him and the man on the steps. The crowd had tasted something different, a truth unpolished but undeniable, and the CEO's bravado could not wash it away. The man smiled faintly, not mockingly but knowingly, as though the CEO's reaction had only confirmed his expectations. He did not need to argue. He had already won something greater than the battle of words. He had pierced the illusion. For once, those who had scorned were forced to confront their own assumptions, their own blind allegiance to appearances. His silence now spoke louder than any retort. The French phrases he had released were more than language. They were keys, unlocking the fragility of the crowd's judgment. A child tugged at her mother's coat, whispering, "Mama, he sounds like my teacher." The innocence of the remark spread like a ripple, reminding the adults of what they had just witnessed, stripping away excuses. The man was not entertainment. He was not invisible. He was not the caricature they had painted in their laughter. He was something more, something none of them could yet fully name. As the lobby settled into uneasy quiet, the CEO's laughter thinned into silence. He tapped his pen against his palm, a nervous rhythm betraying the confidence he wore like armor. He had not expected resistance, and certainly not resistance of this kind. Mockery thrived on compliance, on silence from his victim. But this man had chosen neither anger nor compliance. He had chosen to reveal depth, and depth was far harder to dismantle than desperation. The moment stretched, heavy with tension, before the homeless man finally spoke again. His tone was measured, almost gentle, but the undercurrent carried steel. "Language," he said, "is only the beginning. Sometimes it is the only bridge people will recognize before they see the truth on the other side." His words floated in the air, enigmatic yet undeniable, settling into the conscience of everyone present. The CEO shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the balance of the room had tipped further than he wanted to admit. Yet he clung to the thin thread of authority that his wealth and title offered. What he did not yet realize was that the thread was fraying, strand by strand, pulled apart by a man who had spoken only a few sentences but managed to unravel an entire illusion of superiority. The battle was far from over, but the first blow had been struck, and it had not come from anger. It had come from wisdom.